Welcome to episode 4 of Inside SFPS. My name is Cody Donarski, Public Information Officer with Santa Fe Public Schools, and today I am joined with a very special guest. Today, my guest is Santa Fe Public Schools Board of Education President Kate Noble. President Noble, how are you today?
Great. Glad to be here.
I am very excited for this. I think it's going to be a very interesting episode. I know you have a very interesting career path. I know you started in media, kind of similar to me, and now you're the board president. You are on the board at Growing Up New Mexico. Is that probably?
I'm the vice president for policy and stakeholder engagement. Yeah.
Awesome. So to get started, kind of want to dive into a little bit about you, where you're from. I know you're from Santa Fe, where you went to school. I know you went in Santa Fe Public Schools. Talk about your time here and then how you ended up at BBC and in New York. And all of that good stuff. So you are from Santa Fe and you went to EJ Martinez, if I remember correctly.
I did. EJ Martinez, and then Capshaw was junior high at the time, and graduated from Santa Fe High School.
And then after you graduated from Santa Fe High School, did you move right to New York, or where did you go after?
I did. I went straight to New York that September. I moved into my dorm at Columbia University to study film.
And what made you into film? Because for me, my interest started in high school. We had a TV news broadcast. So our first period or block, we called it, we did blocks, was you'd go to your class. It was 80 or 90 minutes. And then between block 1 and 2, we had a 10-minute newscast for the announcements.
Oh, fun.
So that's how I got into it. But how did you get into film?
Well, it started at the Santa Fe High School Theater, really. That was my thing in high school. I was, at some point, the president of the Thespian Club, and I had a wonderful theater teacher at the beginning of my career at Santa Fe High. And then he left, and the theater department was a little bit adrift, and I stepped up, as did a couple of others, to do productions, because I was always sort of interested in that. I think we might talk about it now as project-based learning. And for me, the project was a play and putting on a play and bringing in an audience. And I wanted to expand the theater crowd to involve the music people and the dance people and the art people, to be much more, because of course you need sets, and I wanted to do musicals, and then you need dancers and as well as musicians. So I co-directed with a friend of mine my first play, and then was the assistant director for another play. And Santa Fe High hadn't done musicals in a very long time, and did manage to bring in some new talent and fresh blood into the theater department. But ultimately, I remember standing in the back of the theater as the curtain went up and thinking, this is a wonderful experience, but I want to have a bigger impact. What does that? Well, movies do that, and they still have the immediacy where you can walk into a movie theater and experience it with a group of people. So somehow, by that logic, I wanted to tell stories, and film seemed the right medium, given that I was very clear that I liked working sort of in production and in that storytelling mode. And funnily enough, when I got to Columbia, a couple things happened. I'd been working on films, actual movies, the first one was based out at Bonanza Creek Ranch. And I couldn't handle the all-in, all-out nature of the film business. And even this was just for my summers. And I was working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and spending all of my time with the people on that production. And then I'd go back to college. And I did this for the first 2 summers, actually, that I was in college. And I just thought, I can't do this. This is too emotionally wrenching. I get close to these people, and then I have to go away. There's got to be something more regular. So I thought, okay, I'll do television. Right around that time, I think I took this documentary course as part of my film education at Columbia. And also I had this big light bulb, as you can do in your sort of teens and 20s, that I didn't want to tell made up stories, that I wanted to tell real stories. There's so many good real stories to be told in the documentary universe. So before too long, between documentaries and wanting something more regular like television, I found my way into TV news.
So from going wanting to be behind the scenes in movies to being in front of the camera in news television. Was it your first job, at least TV job, was BBC?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there were a couple internships before that at PBS and at MTV. Yeah. I actually covered the election when Bob Dole ended up running against Bill Clinton as an intern for MTV. And I logged a lot of tapes and learned a lot about politics that year. But then actually my last internship in college was with the BBC desk where I was hired. And that ended up being my actual only real TV job. And just to correct one thing, I never actually wanted to be in front of the camera. I mean, I ended up wanting to be in front of the camera. I went as a producer. I knew I was a good producer. That was like fish to water. I was very into being a TV producer. The reason I went on camera was honestly because I got tired of people who looked good but didn't understand the story messing up the words I gave them to speak. And so I did it kind of because I was mad at folks not being as good at understanding the subject as I was.
And that's been something that is so unique about TV news is I always say that TV reporters and news reporters are they have to be jack of all trades. You have to know so much about what's going on. And especially in TV news, if you're not kind of on a beat, you have to really every day you're learning something new. And when I was working at KOAT, one day I would be covering education. So I'd be all in on learning education. The next day I'm covering crime. And the next day I'm in court. So you're kind of having to learn all of these little things at one time. And it gets difficult. So if you're not fully invested in the story, I can see where that's tough.
Yes. Or if your core value proposition, which for many of the anchors is to just look good and be smooth on camera. And it's not as much about understanding the story. And I shouldn't throw stones at that because it is incredibly demanding, as you say, for people to get their heads around, especially for anchors who have to be able to do an interview, on the fly, that sort of thing. Although we did have a beat. I mean, our beat was business and economics news. Yeah. I wasn't covering crime. I actually never covered education, really. I did manage to cover sports sometimes because sports is big business.
Oh, yeah.
And I actually wanted to there was a decent period of time when I really wanted to be a sports broadcaster. And some of that had to do with not enough representation of women in sports broadcasting. Yes,
definitely, especially out in that
still
time.
A thing. Yeah. And that was even more a thing a long time ago. But, covering and that, which I did for 10 years. And I still think journalism is such a blessed profession because of that. You get to become an expert on something. You have access to really important people in the area of whatever you're covering immediately. So I spent 10 years talking to the chief economists of the biggest banks and brokerages in New York and on Wall Street, covering the International Monetary Fund, the IMF and World Bank, talking to their chief economists. I was on a first name basis with lots of them had their cell phone numbers. And even one of them gave me the quote that ended up opening my letter for application of employment at the city of Santa Fe, which was a position that asked for, I think, a degree or a master's degree in business or economics because it was in economic development. But he said to me, doing a job the way you do it, doing this job, being a business reporter, the way you do it is like getting a master's degree every 2 years. And so I sort of used that quote, and it was better put than that, and said, by that calculation, having worked for the BBC for 10 years, I have 5 master's degrees in the subject area.
So what made you want to come back? Were you over NYC? Were you just wanting to move? What kind of triggered you to kind of come back home?
Really, it was family. It was probably most immediately the death of my grandmother, and watching my mother, who was an only child, sort of experience that and wanting to support her. But I was part of the reason I was able to come back was I told myself I can always go back to New York City. But truly, I had left the BBC full time, was freelancing. I'd been doing it for 10 years, and 10 years of daily news, as you may know, is exhausting.
It's tough.
And I did it from age 21 to 31. And I was 31, and honestly, my biological clock started ticking. I'd left the BBC and was freelancing. My grandmother was here and she was dying. And I started to just want to be in New Mexico. So I ended up leaving New York City and saying, you know what, it'll always be there. You can go back. Because during my time in New York, I thought I was there forever. But I really just found myself wanting to be here, wanting to be with my family, wanting to be in the New Mexico sunshine. And the gravity pulled me back. It didn't hurt that I met a guy I liked, though I was very careful to not move back for the guy. Yeah. But, I did marry him and have his child. So
it all worked out.
Yeah, that all worked out. And the biological clock thing, can be very real.
So you had mentioned the job with City of Santa Fe. Was that your first job when you got back?
I did some contract work before that, but yeah, that was the first real job. And I took almost a year off. I was so tired from those 10 years at the BBC and did freelance and contract work. So there was about a year's gap between that and when I moved back and got settled. And I had started asking around town because I thought, what do I want to do? And I thought, well, I have, these 5 master's degrees or whatever. I hadn't thought about that yet, but I have all this experience and knowledge about how businesses work, how economies work. I want to work on developing the economy of my hometown. So I started networking and asking people about jobs and economic development. And little did I know at the time that the economic development model, as it still largely is today, is a recruitment model, sort of bring intel to Rio Rancho. I just understood the words. We're going to develop an economy. And I don't know whether to say it's fortunate or not, because the Great Recession was certainly not fortunate. There was a lot of economic pain that happened. But for my particular career, I started pretty much at the City of Santa Fe right as the Great Recession began.
So like 07, 08?
Yes, 07, 08. And I did a contract with the City of Santa Fe and worked very well with the team there and then got hired. And as a result, we sort of threw out the playbook on economic development. And David Koss was mayor at the time. I had a wonderful boss. There was just a lot of savvy in the political leadership. And I started saying, well, what about entrepreneurship? What about cultivating small businesses? I had smart friends saying things like, rather than trying to bring 200 jobs in an industrial recruitment project, could you get 50 businesses to create 4 jobs or 100 to create 2 or some combination? So I then spent about 10 years working on a lot of different economic development projects, but a real emphasis on entrepreneurial development.
Is there something that you had done during that time that people would know or kind of say like, oh yeah, I know about this? Or was there anything kind of notable or that people would say like, oh yeah, I can remember that, or I know that? Is there anything like that?
There are loads of things and loads of companies that started and grew during that time that I worked with very personally, and it's such a good feeling now. But the big one, I suppose, was a project called Mix Santa Fe, and we did networking. This was actually begun partly when Thornburg Mortgage went under and was laying off about 200 people, most of them younger professionals making good salaries with strong educational backgrounds. And it began as talent retention. And something called the Talent Task Force I pulled together. But we thought, what could we do to keep younger people in this community? It's still a conversation that's happening like 15 years later. But ultimately, Mix became a talent recruitment and retention project, primarily retention in Santa Fe. We had 4 reasons people stay in a community: family, relationship, job, or friend group. And we thought, well, we probably can't influence the family piece, but we can help people find someone to date, find a job, and find friends. The other 3 reasons people stay. So we did 10 events a year for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
And it was massive. And within that, we did a business accelerator that was called BizMix. I did that for 8 years, so it must have begun 2 years after Mix started. But there was a lot of community work, and there were lots of goals to promote businesses and underutilized spaces, to network the community together, all in service of plugging in and creating a vibrancy and a talent economy. And funnily enough, all of that thinking about the importance of talent in driving an economy, being the only thing that matters is what people do, the work that people do and how they do it together, because that is how we do incredible things and build giant bridges, not to mention create social programs that lift thousands of people out of poverty and you name it, all of the things that we can do as a society. But all of that thinking about talent is what led me to education. And education truly, and people kept saying in economic development, what's the one thing? And I said, well, it's public education. Mm-hmm. If we get public education really right, every other problem gets solved by the people who got educated in the public education system.
So is that how you got into, that's kind of how you got into education? Because you don't particularly have an education background. I mean, it was mostly entrepreneurship and business and stuff. So is that kind of your not introduction, but that's how you kind of got into being this leader in education?
Yeah, if you call me that, I wouldn't say I'm a leader in education, but
you're a powerful person in education.
I am somebody who is willing to work really hard for this institution, and I think I have a certain number of talents to bring to it. But I am not an expert. But yes, that is precisely how it was through economic development, thinking about what do economies need, how do societies work, and I really became not somebody who just thought about economic development, but really I was like, well, economic development is community development because all of it, and now we have more words around it, I feel like, than we did then, but of, sort of social infrastructure and even collisions and relationships and, relation-based system building and all these things that we talk about now, we were thinking about in sort of very fundamental ways. And we actually led the country in some of the work we did. We consulted as Mix with lots of different entities around this nation about thinking about that and what young people particularly need to grow into professional roles and productivity in communities and economies. And it's all so profoundly connected. But yes, and as I looked for the core of it all, I just kept seeing public education. So
with that, how did you get involved with SFPS? What made you, was becoming a board member the first thing that you did? Were you working?
Yes, it was. And truly it was the day after Donald Trump won the presidential election. I am one of those women who was inspired to run for office in the horror of the moment that Hillary Clinton lost and Donald Trump won the presidential election. So the morning after that happened, though I had some reservations and still do about Hillary Clinton and the Clintons and what I see in terms of what happened during Bill Clinton's time, which was a lot of when I was a business reporter in terms of economies. Some of those things are coming back and are bearing fruit. And I remember, watching the Treasury Secretary doing a briefing, Robert Rubin, the one person I fangirled over more than anybody else in my life because I'm that nerdy.
Some people fan over celebrities and movie stars.
And Robert Rubin made me sweat and have heart palpitations and be unable to speak. I was such a fangirl. But, hearing him talk about globalization and lowering trade barriers, and I found myself thinking, how can the Democrats be the party of global trade, lowering these barriers, and unions? Because don't we need domestic production? There were just some things that started, being dissonant that have come back many, many years later. And I'm now old enough that I get to remember all those things. But truly, the prospect of seeing a woman be president and a woman who was deeply and profoundly qualified, who'd been a senator, who'd been a secretary of state, who had been a first lady, which, make no mistake, is somebody who's very close to the president, just seemed like a big moment. And then to have it stolen by this dirty talking horror show, as honestly I saw Donald Trump, even if I actually can agree with some interesting things about him. Anyway, I woke up that morning and I was devastated. And my son, and I was crying. I was in bed. My son came in and he said, "Mom, are we sick? We're not going to school today." And I probably wouldn't have gotten out of bed if it hadn't been for him. And I said, no, you have to go to school. We have to go on. And as I thought about it, I'd seen the misinformation proliferating on social media. I'm a trained journalist. I can tell the difference between a fact and absolute BS. And I had seen people I know sharing BS and nonsense. And I found myself thinking media literacy is a huge part of the problem. And it's because our public education system is not doing what it needs to do. And the solution is our public education system being stronger. So with that thought, I made a phone call, and truly by the end of the day, it took one day for me to decide I was running for the board. And what I learned in that phone call was that I was in a district where the incumbent wasn't running again, and filing day was a month later. And so I was pretty clear that, and then I started doing my homework and talking to people, and I got the blessing of the outgoing then board president, Susan Duncan, and talked to lots of people and managed to talk my way into being unopposed in that first time I ran for the board.
So the stars really aligned for you, kind of just the global things that were happening across the country, and it kind of all aligned it right here.
A friend of mine said, this is what we call, I think it was, anyway, I'm not going to go with the Spanish word, because it might mean different things in different contexts, but this is when the universe supports you in the choices you make and what you do. She said to me, the road, it really did feel like suddenly the road was just super clear in front of me.
Yeah. Which is great. And it's interesting to see how that happens. Now, this was probably, 6 years ago now? Five.
I have been on the board 5 years as of March 1.
March 1. Yep. So with that, you are now, or have been for a few years, the board president. How has that role changed you, and kind of from being a board member, being a board president, how has that role kind of changed, and how what you've brought to that role?
Well, the whole thing is a giant learning curve, because public education is a complex, obviously critically important institution, but there is so much to it with the federal money. And the board, of course, has three primary roles: to hire and fire the superintendent, to approve and oversee the budget and finances, including property of the district, and to make policy. And as a board member, for a lot of people, you get on the board and to realize that in some ways the board's power is very limited. The superintendent runs the district. The public education department of the state of New Mexico and the federal education department deliver the rules and the funding. And, so you kind of do those things in between. And so it was actually a real shock in some ways when I got on the board and realized my limited ability to impact. But it has made me evolve. And since over the 5 years, I've realized there's something to that system, and this balance between not letting public education gyrate wildly with political cycles. You wouldn't want to do that. And yet being clear to have a governing body with a certain amount of local decision-making and control, which is completely appropriate, that is elected and therefore accountable only to the people, to the community, to the voters. I guess what I've learned primarily is the importance of, for lack of a better way of putting it, the softer side of leadership, the bully pulpit, the holding of a group, the making sure that many voices are heard, and just the setting of a culture that is inclusive, that is listening, that is clear and communicative. And so it's really not what I expected it to be. And I don't even remember, I don't think I can say what I did expect it to be, but as I've developed, I've realized that I love it. And I think I'm good at it because it is what I've always done, even back to those days of the Santa Fe High School Theater, which is work with a team with different complementary skills.
And that's what I say would be the strongest point of the SFPS board. And being in news, working at KOAT, we cover the whole state. And I got to watch a lot of districts, see a lot of boards, see how a lot of boards operate. At the time, I probably didn't really understand how things worked. But now being in education, being around the board and seeing it, Santa Fe really has a pretty unified board with one goal in mind. And to me, that is benefiting the children of Santa Fe. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important for people to know is the board in Santa Fe really is unified, and they're not really separated by differences and agendas and politics. I mean, they really are aligned. And I think I can go on about it because I've seen boards across this state that don't keep kids in mind. They bring politics into schools because that's what they want. And I compliment you because it's your board, but I think everyone across the board really has every kid's best in mind.
I think that's really right. And I appreciate you saying that. And we have a spectacular board now. And, I do think as long as I have been on the board, it has been clear that, the best interest of kids is unifying. Sometimes that looks different. And the fact is the board is very harmonious right now. It was bumpier when I started, and I think it was bumpier before that. And there are certainly some very bumpy times in the history of the Santa Fe Public Schools. But, it is a giant credit, I think, to our board, to the voters, to this community that we have such clear objectives and goals and that we are really able to put children at the center of our thinking. And right now I would just say, we have a really great board, and it has been incredibly wonderful to work with the board that we have. It's evolved, a little bit, and there are things that I miss about previous board members that surprised me, that made me crazy in the moment. And now I realize the important functions that those things served, and you name it. It's a whole evolution, but it is really important to keep the kids at the center of it. And I think, as the board president, a lot of what I do is run the meeting, try and drive to consensus, make sure everybody's heard. It's a facilitation role, even more than it is a leadership role. And leadership, of course, does come into it, again, sort of in setting the culture and in different ways. But, the board president, I do see as more of a facilitator than anything else.
We are recording this in March. When this comes out, it won't be March, but March is National Women's History Month. Being a woman in leadership and having such influence, being on the board, the board president, the vice president of policy at Growing Up New Mexico. We have a board of 5. 4 of the 5 people on the board are women. How important is that to have? And, for someone like me, I have a daughter. Just my own personal thing is my daughter is going to be able to grow up seeing no limits. Mm-hmm. There is going to be, if she wants to be a board president, she can. If she wants to be a superintendent, she can. If she wants to be, a sports reporter or be on BBC, she has, those kind of role models to look after. How important is that? And can you talk about just what that means? Yes.
Well, for one thing, I guess I have to say there will be limits for your daughter. Unfortunately, it's very, very clear to me that institutional sexism, as well as institutional racism and other sort of institutional biases, are built into our system. And we have a lot of work to do. It has to be a commitment that we make to undo those things in a continual improvement way every day, all the time. But representation really does matter. It really does. And, I think it's wonderful. It's like Ruth Bader Ginsburg's answer. How many is too many women to be Supreme Court justices? 9, all of them. There have been all men. Why couldn't you have all women? I don't see that, having 4 board members that are women, or even 5, or however many it ever ends up being, is too many. But education is one of the areas where we have been comfortable with women in leadership roles longer, which is why you see that. Women have been school principals forever. And Lorraine Price, former board member who has passed on, whom I miss terribly, would talk to me about that. She was a former principal, and she said, this is the study in women's leadership, is women being principals of schools, which is really interesting to think about and to go down that road. But when I ran for mayor, there were a number of reasons I won for mayor, not least of them being what I mentioned earlier, which was realizing how little real power the school board has when a mayor and a city has a lot, a home rule city. It's a whole different ballgame. And of course, I'd spent 10 years there. But part of the reason I did it, because I knew I wasn't favored to win from the get-go, but part of the reason I did it was representation. And I thought about my goddaughter, because I don't have a daughter, but I do have a goddaughter. And I thought, don't say that on the radio. But I'm not going to let this election cycle pass by with all dudes up on the stage speaking. I want people to see, at the very least, young women to see me hold my own. And the fact is that journey was one of the most sobering I've ever had in terms of learning about how deep sexism runs. It was awful. And I know that racism also runs that deep. And I feel like even, my own personal experience as a person of incredible structural advantage as a white woman with an education and a supportive family and all those things, that we need to do the same thing for racial equity and racial dynamics. We need to see people of color more in leadership positions everywhere. And it's women of color, there's the intersectional thing. But ultimately, it is critical because humans, in some ways, we're fairly simple creatures. And when you see someone in a role, that that's okay, who looks like you or who is like you, that that's okay for you to do too. So it's crucially important. What I wonder about, and the sort of next level thinking to me, is how different styles of leadership work, because there is no way around that we are all programmed to believe that what is in essence a white male style of leadership is how leadership looks. But, Native American women, indigenous women, have a very different way of being in the world very often. There's just some cultural underpinnings that are different. And to think about that, and to think about women and collaborative leadership, more sort of community oriented, yes, about the hero canon and more about maybe other things, is what I'm really interested in seeing as we develop different types of leaders, women leaders, people of color, and, of all different cultures and backgrounds, to see if we can embrace multiculturalism and multifaceted leadership credentials. I would really love to see that happen more.
I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the conversation. I think it was very insightful. It's been probably one of my favorite conversations we've had so far as on the podcast. At least I know we're 4 episodes in, but I've really enjoyed this conversation. To end the episode, I'll ask the question that I've asked our past 2 guests, is what is the best piece of advice or guidance that you've ever received from a teacher?
It's a fabulous question. I love it. And I will go back to a story that I've told a few times, actually, from the board seat, which goes back to Betty Graham, who was my 5th and 6th grade science teacher at E.J. Martinez. And it's actually a lesson she taught us, and it was about observation and the principles of observation in science and the scientific method. So she would have us select an object, let's say this pink pen I have right here. And she would say, write down all of your observations about it. So I would write that it is pink, it has black writing, it has a button at the top that you can click on to make the part that you write with come out. It has something that will hold it on paper or in your pocket. It has a rounded shape. And then you get to the end of everything you can say about this pen. And Betty Graham would always say, write more observations. And we'd say, well, we can't, teacher. I've said everything there is to say. And she said, no, there's not. Write more observations. And then you look at the object as I look at this and I think, oh, well, I can say that there's a scratch here that has happened. I can say that there's a basketball printed here as part of the writing. I can say that when the pen part comes out, it's silver, not black or pink. And the point being that you would hit this wall and think you were done. And that then you have to push through. And she made us do this and push through and see more. And you always can. And it's like a dam breaking that all of a sudden you're like, oh, wait, I see a bunch of other things. And it has served me incredibly well. It first started about the conversation about closing schools. And there was all this sort of black and white and all of this. And I just thought, we've got to be able to see more. We've got to push through and push ourselves to really get to a next level of observation and understanding of what's going on. And I still don't have the answers on some of the inequities and issues in our district that lead to people saying we need to close schools. But I am still convinced it's the right answer, and that if we push through as a community and in any critical leadership decision or something that needs to happen as a community, that ethos of observe more is really important and foundational and can lead to the best solutions and the greatest wisdom.